They were in the parking lot outside the Cotton Club in Culver City. The show was done. The heavy, smoke-filled air of the club had given way to the crisp, cooling Pacific breeze of a late Los Angeles night. Louis Armstrong and Vic Berton were smoking. It was quiet out there, a momentary sanctuary away from the blinding spotlights, the clinking of illegal Prohibition-era glasses, and the relentless demands of the adoring, mostly white crowds inside. Berton, a white drummer who played with a furious orchestral precision, shared a deep musical kinship with Armstrong. They were passing a joint back and forth, exhaling into the California darkness, letting the adrenaline of a 3-hour set slowly drain from their shoulders. Two officers walked up, two shadows stepping out from the ambient glow of the street lamps. Detectives, plainclothes, moving with the casual arrogance of men who owned the night. It took about 30 seconds for the situation to become clear. The marijuana was not hidden. There was no confusion about what it was, no frantic attempt to stomp it out or toss it under the tires of a parked Ford. They were caught dead to rights. They were arrested on the spot. The officers didn't care about the music. They didn't care about the brilliant, unprecedented architecture of the solos Armstrong had just laid down inside the club. They saw two musicians, one black, one white, sharing a narcotic in a parking lot. Handcuffs were produced. The quiet sanctuary of the night shattered. They were transported to the Los Angeles Police Department's Central Jail, where they would spend the night in a cold, concrete holding cell, a stark contrast to the velvet and brass of the Cotton Club. The Los Angeles newspapers had the story the next morning. It was November 1930. Louis Armstrong was 29 years old and undeniably one of the most famous, most influential jazz musicians in America. He had been performing in Los Angeles for several months, an extended residency that was meant to conquer the West Coast. He was playing to packed houses, broadcasting live on the radio, making landmark recordings, actively becoming the monumental cultural force he was destined to be everywhere he went. The arrest was not a secret. It could not be a secret. It was splashed across the morning papers. It stayed in the papers, and the people who managed the vast commercial machinery around Armstrong looked at it with the particular sweating anxiety of individuals whose livelihood depends entirely on keeping a public figure acceptable, profitable, and out of a jail cell. Armstrong's manager at the time, Johnny Collins, was not a calm man under pressure. He was a tough, abrasive character with mob ties and a volatile temper. Collins handled most difficulties in life by adding more difficulty. He viewed Armstrong less as a human being and more as an exceptionally lucrative, thoroughbred horse. His response to the arrest was a frantic, terrifying combination of legal scrambling and explosive personal fury directed squarely at Armstrong. Collins stormed into the jail and later the hotel rooms, pacing, yelling, threatening. He acted as if the problem were not the arrest itself, nor the systemic policing of the era, but rather the sheer existence of a behavior that could jeopardize the cash flow. To Collins, Armstrong had committed the ultimate sin. He had risked the machinery. The charge was possession of marijuana, a narcotic violation under California law at the time. The legal landscape regarding the drug was shifting. It wasn't yet the subject of the hysterical, nationwide reefer madness campaigns of the late 930 but it was illegal, and it was prosecuted. Collins threw money and influence at the problem. He hired lawyers. He leveraged club owners. He pulled every string available in the corrupt, tightly woven political tapestry of 930 Los Angeles. Ultimately, the case was resolved with a suspended sentence and no jail time beyond that initial, humiliating night of the arrest. Armstrong was back on the bandstand, horn to his lips, performing within days. The immediate, tangible, legal consequences were manageable. The fines were paid. The judges were satisfied. The other consequences, however, were not resolved so cleanly. They lingered because they involved a fundamental question that Armstrong was entirely uninterested in treating as a question. Would he stop? Would he modify his behavior to satisfy the commercial, legal, and social expectations of the rigid world around him? Would he bow his head, issue an apology, and let the arrest serve as the disciplinary lesson it was clearly intended to serve? The answer was no. Not defiantly, not as a loud public statement, not as a calculated political act. Simply, quietly, immovably, no. Louis Armstrong had been smoking marijuana, which he affectionately called gauge, muggles, or shuzit, since his early days in New Orleans. He wrote about it later in his private letters and autobiographical manuscripts in terms that were beautifully, radically unashamed. He called it a light that he didn't see any earthly reason to put out. He described it not as a vice, but as a medicine and a companion. It was something that relaxed him after the grueling, lip-busting physical exertion of playing the trumpet for hours on end. It was something that cleared his mind of the racial prejudice and exhausting negotiations of his daily reality. He noted that it had no downside that he could personally identify, unlike alcohol, which he watched destroy the lives, livers, and careers of countless musicians during Prohibition. To Armstrong, the gauge was peaceful. It made you want to listen to music, eat good food, and laugh. It didn't make you want to start a bar fight. And so he had absolutely no intention of giving it up simply because a law he considered arbitrary, hypocritical, and unjust, said that he should. He continued. This was not the reckless behavior of a man who didn't understand consequences. That is a crucial distinction. Armstrong was not a fool. He was, in fact, one of the most brilliant, sophisticated navigators of the American entertainment landscape of his era. He understood exactly what was required of him commercially to survive and thrive as a black man in a deeply segregated America. He had spent 20 years meticulously calibrating his public presentation. He knew what the audiences he needed to reach would receive, what they would reject, and what they would violently punish. He understood the necessary geometry of his smile, the exact pitch of his stage banter, the precise amount of deference required to keep the bookings coming and the venues safe. He was not naive about any of it, not for a single second. But he was also not willing to surrender everything. He refused to be entirely consumed by the persona he had created to survive. There were the things the commercial machinery could have. They could have the presentation. They could have the legendary smile. They could have the warmth, the sweat, the recording sessions, the punishing travel schedule, the unparalleled genius of the performance. But there were things the machinery could not have. He drew his boundaries quietly, without press releases or grand announcements. This meant that the people on the other side of those lines, managers, record executives, journalists, politicians, often didn't even realize the boundaries were there until they violently ran into one. The 1,930 arrest ran into one. Armstrong heard everything Johnny Collins said in those screaming matches after the jail release. He listened. He nodded. He agreed where he practically agreed, that the press was a headache, that the fines were a nuisance, and he stayed dead quiet where he didn't. He didn't argue philosophy with a mob-connected manager. He just held his ground internally. When Collins was finally done yelling, his face red and out of breath, the underlying reality of the situation was essentially exactly the same as it had been before the arrest. Armstrong was playing that night, and Armstrong was going to keep being Armstrong. He wrote about marijuana late in his life, long after Johnny Collins was gone, with a breathtaking directness that would have been professionally fatal, or at least highly dangerous, in any earlier decade. He typed out his thoughts on his personal typewriter, hunting and pecking the keys in his den in Queens, New York. He said it was his choice. He said it made him feel good in a world that often tried to make him feel small. He pointed out the staggering hypocrisy of a society that celebrated him for his music, while criminalizing the very thing that helped him endure the burden of creating it. He said he had smoked it for 50 years and was still here, still standing, and still playing better than anyone else alive. That, to his mind, seemed to be the most complete, undeniable, empirical argument in its favor. He said the laws against it were fundamentally wrong, drafted by people who didn't understand it, and he had never, not for a single day, personally accepted their moral authority. He also wrote about the gauge in ways that profoundly connected it to the much larger existential question of his life: what he was willing to accept from the world around him and what he absolutely wasn't. He was willing to accept a lot. He had to be. If he hadn't been, he would have been destroyed long before he ever left Chicago. The world he operated in required constant, exhausting negotiation. It required constant calculation. It demanded a ceaseless, hyper-vigilant awareness of what was safe and what wasn't, which hotels he could sleep in, which restaurants would serve him, which police officers might look the other way, and which ones might reach for a baton. He gave that world what it needed in order to keep playing his horn. He paid the tax of fame and race in mid-century America. But there was a floor, and what was below the floor was below the floor. There are endlessly interesting things about what Louis Armstrong chose to hold firm on compared to what he willingly let go. He let go of financial control for much of his early career, allowing managers to take exorbitant cuts. He let go of booking decisions, playing wherever he was told to play. He let go, in many frustrating respects, of the day-to-day terms of his own commercial life. Because fighting those specific battles, the boardroom battles, the contract battles, was not what he felt he was put on this earth to do. What he was here to do was play. And the playing required a massive, sturdy structure around it that he couldn't build himself while also maintaining his genius. The people who built that structure extracted massive costs, and Armstrong paid them. He paid them in sweat, in money, and in tolerance. But the particular things that were exclusively his, the private behaviors, the specific, quiet freedoms, the invisible lines between what he owed the performance and what he owed his own soul, those he held with a quiet, terrifying firmness. It was a firmness that genuinely shocked people. People who thought the jovial, sweating, smiling public Louis Armstrong was the whole Louis Armstrong were entirely unprepared for the steel underneath. He was not just the smile. The public Armstrong was merely the part he gave away. It was the part that could be shared with millions of strangers without costing him his core identity. Everything below that surface was his, and he kept it, guarded it, and protected it with the exact same thoroughness and dedication with which he gave the top of it away. The 1,930 arrest outside the Cotton Club was not the last time he smoked marijuana, not the second to last, Not even close to the last. He smoked it through the Great Depression. He smoked it through World War II. He smoked it through the Civil Rights Movement. He smoked it until the very last years of his life, when his failing heart and physical health required him to put down the horn and, eventually, put down the gauge. He wrote about it in his letters to friends, in his autobiographical notes, and in interviews, without a single shred of embarrassment, qualification, or apology. He had decided how he felt about it a long time ago, looking up at the stars in New Orleans, and that decision did not require revision simply because two plainclothes officers had walked up in a parking lot in Culver City in November 1930. The suspended sentence ran its course. It meant he kept playing. Johnny Collins calmed down eventually, counting the box office receipts until the day they inevitably parted ways. The newspapers moved on, finding some new scandal, some new star to build up or tear down. The vast, relentless machinery resumed its grinding, profitable hum. But the music remained. Armstrong walked back onto a stage just a few days after that humiliating arrest. He stepped into the spotlight in Los Angeles, the brass of his trumpet gleaming under the stage lights. He raised the horn to his scarred lips, and he played. He played the exact way he always played, with unmatched power, with heartbreaking invention, and with a joyful, transcendent defiance. He played as if nothing in the world, not the police, not his manager, not the newspapers, not the laws of a prejudiced nation, mattered more than the music. Because nothing did.